with a special interest in how war and peace among the French, British, and Indian peoples, 18th century America shaped the modern world. Growing up in Western Pennsylvania instilled in him a passion for the French and Indian War era, and inevitably for the Pittsburgh Steelers football. He went on to earn his doctorate in American history at the College of William and Mary, and is currently professor of history at the Citadel, where he teaches cadets and officer candidates about U.S. military history and early American history. His most recent book, Braddock's Defeat, The Battle of the Monongahela and the Road to Revolution, is a bestseller. It was published in 2015 by Oxford University Press in the Pivotal Moments in American History series. The series was edited by the eminent historians James McPherson and David Hackett Fisher, who described Preston as one of the most gifted young historians writing today. All right, so we have that book in the back for you to look at. Also, his other book, The Other Face of Battle, which he's a co-author of. So, with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Dr. Preston and let him talk about world liberty tonight.
Thanks. Hey, thank you all for coming out this evening. I really appreciate you being here. And bottom line, I just want to have a good conversation tonight. So I want, this is your task. I want you to, as you go through this film, keep mental note of what questions you have about this story and how it relates to the themes of this symposium. Last but not least, I just want to extend my thanks to the organizers of the War, Peace, Justice Symposium, the invitation to be here. It's a great honor, and I'm just thankful to be here with you tonight. So let's go ahead and roll this film. Let me just by way of introduction. When the Forest Ran Red it's an award-winning documentary on the story of Braddock's expedition. The producer, his name is Robert Matson, and he is a colleague who I've collaborated with for many years. We're both involved in a nonprofit organization called the Braddock Road Preservation Association, which hosts an annual meeting on French and Indian War history. So Robert and I go way back, and I know that you're really going to enjoy this documentary.
Is that they had evil designs, and that it was a mere pretext, that they had never pretended to come to us as anything but enemies.
It's not a battle, it's murder. They scalp the dead and they kill the wounded.
The enemy's trial began again at 6 o'clock, with more fury than ever. It was a mortifying close to Washington's first campaign.
These savages.
That's befitting the themes of this symposium. I think that one of the most important questions we could ask is, why do wars escalate? And here in this documentary, we have kind of a case study of a regional conflict, tension in the Ohio Valley that escalates more and more and eventually into a global war that we know of as the 7 Years' War. So let me just throw that question out to y'all. How did you see this conflict escalating over the course of these few years presented in the documentary?
Well, I see it's something analogous to our own time. You know, the hubris going in reminds me of when we went into Iraq and Baghdad. And initially, we sent people in who did not understand fully the ways and the people in Baghdad. And if you remember, we were in control, but then control completely broke down. They broke into the museums and had riots in the streets. And it's at that point, I believe, that our involvement in the conflict there escalated and continued and continued and continued. And I think a lot of that was due to the hubris going in and saying, well, you know, we're going in, we're doing a great thing. We have the superior military, and therefore, you know, we will win. But I see the same thing here.
Yeah, that's a very interesting parallel that you're making, and certainly one of the interesting things we see here is the idea that for the British, when they send over Braddock's expedition to America, in their minds, like you're saying, that's going to be the end of the story. You know, that they do not anticipate the possibility of defeat of other ramifications that might spring from that type of defeat. And I think that you know, without resorting to all of the stereotypes of the British as being arrogant and full of themselves, I think we can see that there was perhaps some justified hubris on the part of Braddock, that he had accomplished something that no other British force had ever accomplished in previous colonial history, and that was actually projecting power across long distances, across the Appalachian Mountains. You know, keep in mind that there was no road across the Appalachians prior to 1755. Braddock carves one, a well-engineered wagon road that in itself has some future consequences. But let's try to keep this line of discussion going. Go ahead, sir.
You know, I'd sort of go back to the very beginning of the film, because I thought it was very interesting when they said, well, here's the different perspectives. So here's the perspectives from the British and the Americans at that particular point in time. And they are expanding, and they know they need land. And then here's the perspective from the French, and they're just trying to maintain lines of communication, you know, down in the Mississippi and so on and so forth. And here's the perspective of the Indians. Mm-hmm. So I think, you know, if you look at that and you recognize that, I mean, you got diametrically opposed objectives and goals. And so unless you can envision a negotiated agreement, I mean, the war is going to happen. I mean, so my parallel to that situation, I mean, look at Russia and Ukraine today.
Right.
I mean, you know, you've got diametrically opposed national positions. And you think, I mean, I know, you know, people were talking about, well, how are we going to get a negotiated agreement back in February? You know, and even now today, how do we stop this? How do we stop the war and get peace? Oh, and then there's that word in there, justice. I don't know how that's going to fit into this thing. But you know, you have a situation that I think That's what was faced in what became the French and Indian War, that you've got these diametrically opposed objectives, and the negotiation just wasn't going to happen. And so everybody decides to fight it out.
Yeah, and I think that's a key dynamic here, is that each of these contestants, they reach a point where they're in their minds, there can be no negotiation, that there can be no surrender of whatever principle or territory or land that's at stake, or strategic interest that's at stake. And the interesting question in all of this for me is, at what point does Britain decide that this is an issue that can only be decided via force? And I think that's why Braddock's campaign is indeed so significant, because the British are, the documentary didn't point this out, but in 1754, when news of Washington's defeat at Fort Necessity reaches London, the British government, in the span of just a few weeks, has decided upon force as the solution. And they didn't just decide upon sending General Braddock's force to take care of business in the Ohio Valley. There were actually 3 other British expeditions that were going to be sent against other French targets in North America. So one of those was a British expedition against Fort Niagara, at that strategic juncture. One was against the French fort of Crown Point in the Champlain Valley. And then the other one was a French outpost near Nova Scotia. So the British were essentially assuming the risk of war. But they're also assuming that by striking this preemptive blow, that it can be contained to North America. And that, as it turns out, was a fatal presumption. Because again, they didn't anticipate that one of these expeditions would end in absolutely catastrophic defeat, with all sorts of strategic consequences, all bad consequences for them. Well, that's very good.
I think, again, the thinking of whether it's in this time period or other, we can contain the conflict, I think is a flaw in thinking, because of any number of things. You have a major defeat. You have a circumstance where you have maybe a section of the population that calls for revenge or something you did not anticipate.
Right.
And trying to go in and say, well, we have this limited set of objectives, we're going to go in and we're only going to do this much. I think whether you're talking about that period or our current period is a very weak line of thinking.
Right. And back to your example of Iraq, you can see in the planning for Iraqi freedom a lot of similar assumptions at work, that the United States could quickly hand over Iraq back to the liberated Iraqis. Vietnam is also a really excellent case study in gradual, slow escalation that turns into something larger. And in the case of Braddock's expedition, if you think about it like this, here's the real consequence of Braddock's defeat in a nutshell, at least in a strategic sense. So the British aim initially in 1754-55, would you agree with me that it's a pretty limited objective? You know, Braddock he's just trying to throw the French out of the Ohio Valley and claim that possess that territory for Great Britain. This war ends because of how disastrous Braddock's defeat was. It really transforms British grand objectives in the war entirely. Instead of just these limited struggles over disputed territories, the British are determined to avenge Braddock's defeat and eliminate once and for all the French threat in North America entirely. That is precisely why this war ends not with British possession of the Ohio Valley per se, and it ends with the absolute conquest of Canada itself in 1759 and 1760. And that is something that changes the entire trajectory of North American history. In a sense, you could say that the 7 Years' War, the outcome of it sets in motion a lot of the processes that will lead to the creation of modern Canada and, as you saw clearly in the video, the creation of the modern United States.
As the British did succeed, the cost that it was for them was also the beginning of their end of controlling what became the United States. Because the issue there was they had expended so much money, it was such a burden on them at home. There's pressures that involve Americans paying for some of their own defense, which created all sorts of psychological issues and contention, which was the grounds for our declaration, in part, that their success and its cost was the beginning of their loss, at least for this part of North America.
Right. And that's, you know, to carry this story forward like you're doing, it's a remarkable transformation that's happening in the British Empire as a result of the war. You know, when this whole conflict comes to an end in 1763 at the Treaty of Paris, which solidifies British control of Canada, essentially the British now possess, at least in theory, everything east of the Mississippi River. And even the colonists in 1763, they're not anticipating independence. In fact, they're anticipating a glorious future in the British Empire. You know, the French threat has been eliminated. But think about this, you know, from the perspectives of both British leaders in London as well as the colonists themselves, that in the space of 12 years, from 1763 until 1775, that relationship, it goes completely down the drain. And the British are essentially fighting a civil war against each other by 1775. It's completely unexpected and unimaginable in 1763. But I mention that as, again, how dynamic this time period really is. I wish that I could sit down with any of these characters that you learned about, Washington, Gage, and ask them point blank, how do you process the fact that you guys are all fighting together in 1755, and then you're fighting against each other just 20 years later? It's a really remarkable shift.
There's another irony. Think about it. Who wins at Yorktown? It's the French. And if you think about it, they come in alongside of the Americans against the British to get their revenge. It costs them so much, it breaks their finances, which leads to
the revolution.
Right.
So you see some unintended consequences, and in strategy, we have some of our experts here, but it ends ways and means. The means just drain both of them. And causes all sorts of global repercussions. We're not even talking about the Caribbean, Asia, et cetera,
Precisely, and that's again where these wars tend to build upon each other in terms of their consequences. So you're absolutely right, sir.
In addressing the role of the French, we have to also think of what was happening in Europe between the English and the French who were at war, and the participation of the French in the colonies and the support of it was an extension of, what was happening in Europe. Okay, so it wasn't by happenstance or just a happy coincidence that this happened.
Right.
I mean, there were several negotiations, and poor George just couldn't seem to get the message across that, hey man, I need the French,
Right.
And so it happened, but not necessarily for the same reason that maybe George would. There were other reasons why that happened as well.
Yeah. The other thing that your comment made me remember is that these people in the 18th century, I mean, they're not stupid. Like they can see in the offing some of these future challenges. There are French diplomats who I could quote you who are saying in 1763, 64 that France, by saddling Canada on the British, so that the British have to now assume the expense of garrisoning and occupying Canada. There are French officials who are predicting in 1763 that they are basically going to drive a wedge between the American colonists and Great Britain. They can see it. They can see it happening even then. So that's an interesting dynamic too. Yes.
Yeah, they mentioned St. Clair as part of Braddock, but then they mentioned where everybody else went to after that. That's the same St. Clair that had even a bigger defeat on the Wabash, is that not? Or no?
Different St. Clair.
Oh, it is.
This is Sir John St. Clair. He was a deputy quartermaster in North America. He was very conspicuous in Braddock's expedition and really throughout the French and Indian War. A little bit of a local tie-in is that St. Clair is part of the round two. John Forbes's expedition that has the same objective of capturing Fort Duquesne. So the St. Clair whom you learned about here, he would have come right through Carlisle in the context of Forbes's campaign in 1758. He eventually marries an American woman and settles in New Jersey and dies in New Jersey in the 1760s.
Okay. I always thought they were the same person. I never realized it was different St. Clair.
Yeah, but you're thinking of Arthur St. Clair, who was one of Washington's subordinates in the Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. And fast forward just about 40 years later from Braddock's defeat, and the United States Army meets with a similarly catastrophic defeat on the Wabash, which becomes known as St. Clair's defeat in the year 1791. Very interesting detail about St. Clair, and I included this in my book, The Other Face of Battle. He and one of his subordinate officers on their way out into the Ohio Valley in 1790, St. Clair and his subordinate, they actually visit the site of Braddock's defeat. And there's still bones all over the field in the 1790s. So this was an iconic battle for them, and it's doubly surprising that because it was so well known to them and they had actually visited the site, that the same disaster befell them. But that's another theme here, is the repetitive nature of these types of initial battles, where you see hubris on display, you see assumptions of victory, and war is if it's anything, it's chaotic and unpredictable. And there are other examples. Sam, I know you could rattle off half a dozen such engagements in future Indian conflicts.
Well, I was listening to General Dubeck's opening remarks from last spring, earlier today, and he talked about, when we think about war, we think about the conflict portion of it. So the film we just watched. But there's a whole lot of stuff that happens prior to that, and then after that. You know, and so part of that is these cycles of war, of one that just leads into the next. So you have the King George War and this really tenuous peace agreement that everybody knows isn't going to last. They know it's going to fracture somewhere. And you almost see, at least from the British side, a desire for it to fracture. Maybe not with the king, but with the forces, with the people. You know, the British and the French have never got along. Not in America, not in Europe, and it's just a continuation of this. And then you see it at the end of the war, roll right into the next one. It's almost like the fruits from the last war drop to the ground and plant the seeds to the next one. And the question for us is, how do you short circuit that cycle? How do you stop that and finally get you don't have a Gulf War that sows the seeds to lay right into the Iraq War 10 years later?
Yeah, I think that's one short answer to extend your metaphor. This will be kind of the low-hanging fruit. I think is cultural knowledge, and this relates back to your point. I think that not only did the British come in with a kind of tactical arrogance that they're going to dominate any Canadian or French irregulars out there with British discipline. But there's also a level of ignorance in terms of the political realities in the colonies. There's a level of ignorance in the operational challenges involved in American warfare and campaigning. The British are stunned that they've been landed in this place where there are few improved roads. They can't find enough horses and wagons. There's no infrastructure for military supplies, no storehouses, and everything is hard.
I think you point out even in your book very well that Dinwiddie is trying desperately to get the other colonies to help. After Fort Necessity, they won't do anything. And it's actually the British that seem most concerned about what happened in the Americas rather than the Americans.
Right. Yeah, there's that sense that it's actually expressed many times in the French and Indian War that these British officers are sometimes aghast that the colonists can't seem to cooperate together when this mortal threat is like right on their doorstep and this dagger's right at their heart. They can't believe it.
Towards that end, if you think about it, the British had a strategy which they were implementing for a larger picture. The colonies were 13 separate, very small, narrowly focused entities there was no unity in the colonies. There was nobody in charge. Each of them had a unique charter and relationship with the colonial office or the crown or whatever, depending.
Right.
And there was no focus. And there was no focus between those that lived on the seaboard and those that went into the western areas. As a matter of fact, there was contention. And you had the Westerners here march on Philadelphia, for instance. So the British had a vision, but the Americans didn't.
Right, and that's that's actually an interesting angle on Braddock's expedition, is that he was indeed appointed as the commander-in-chief of British forces in North America as a whole. And
how did he control all
and so
those?
he did have, I mean, there's a great newspaper account that I discovered in my research where this one commentator was remarking that that all of the people in the British government who were wanting to reform the American colonies and bring them under a kind of tighter subordination, that they saw Braddock's appointment as commander-in-chief as one of the means of starting to do that. So had Braddock lived, it would have been interesting to see how he would have exercised his powers as commander-in-chief. It certainly would have created more friction. He certainly experienced that himself, even when he was alive with these royal governors. But I think that's all the more to my point that part of what is happening here, big picture, is the American colonies, the colonists, are really coming face to face for the first time with the nature of the empire that they're a part of. And they get to see in Braddock's face the face of what the British imperial leadership looks like as well. So it's kind of this collision, right? Braddock's defeat itself is a collision of conventional versus unconventional forces. The expedition is a kind of collision of two different visions, like you're getting at, of what the British Empire is going to look like. And a lot of the British elites in London have a particular view of what that looks like, but so do the colonists. Yes, ma'am.
Say, with the conversation, I think that one thing that stands out to me too is that a lot of these conflicts do have a racist component, not just stereotypically the elite British and the Native Americans, but a lot of the American colonists had come over here because of persecution in Europe, and they were already predisposed to chafe, and they were, looked down on. The Scots-Irish,
Right.
And I think most of what we recognize as national identities now have in common an inquisitiveness and what we have isn't good enough. A lot of cultures that are sort of a little closer to the ground have. What we have is the status quo, it's great, it works for us. But many more,
I agree with you. That's
technologically advanced.
It's a very perceptive comment.
Keep saying more, more is better.
Yeah, and
more land, more money.
This idea of national identity, this is also something that's in play in Braddock's expedition and the whole story. So in the documentary, when you learned about the behavior of the Virginia provincials or any of the American forces that were attached to Braddock's expedition, you heard Washington say that the Virginians behaved like like men, and they died like soldiers. What Washington's really expressing is this kind of pride of being a British American. And yes, they were using the term American even in the 1750s as a means of identifying themselves and their outlook. And
getting the short end of the stick as alleged British subjects.
right. And so this really cuts to the heart of this conversation here, is that the colonists, remember that in those metaphors that we too easily maybe just take for granted, the metaphor of the parent country, the mother country, and therefore that the colonists are like little children. Those weren't just figures of speech. They really did structure how people thought. And as Benjamin Franklin himself said in one of his little ditties or poems or sayings, and I don't know where it was, Poor Richard's Almanac, he was alluding to that metaphor. He said that in the 1760s, the colonists have grown up. You know, we've ceased to be children. And so I think a lot of this provincial American pride, it's a desire to be treated as fully British subjects and not to be looked down upon by British officers or British leaders as somehow inferior, somehow second class. And that's really at the heart of the American Revolution. It doesn't start out as a groundswell for independence. It starts out as a groundswell for simply being accorded the same rights as every other British subject.
Fellow citizen, yeah. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Let me come back to you, because you had your hand up for a long time. So, okay, sir.
I want to take upon the concept of the identity and so on. The Virginians, in this case, fighting for what they consider to be their country. The British were under contract, not fighting for their country, but essentially fighting for pay. Big difference in point of view and what is driving a soldier. Mm-hmm. And we study and we say, what makes a soldier a warrior instead of a soldier as a contract fighter?
Right. So that's an interesting question. There's a lot of great work now on the motivations of these 18th century regular forces. So in the British Army in the 18th century, it was actually, to use our parlance, an all-volunteer force. It really was. Like, if you, to use that expression, if you took the king's shilling and you enlisted in the king's service, you enlisted for life. Like, basically, you're in the British Army as long as you can put 2 feet, 1 foot in front of another, and bite off a cartridge and that kind of thing. So the British Army, it does have a sense of motivation in the sense of attachment to the monarch. You saw that on display this week with the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II. That type of attachment that the British Army has historically had to the monarchy. So that was an important motivation. I tend to think that these British soldiers were more motivated than we usually give them credit for. And at Braddock's defeat, my friend Steve Brumwell, who remarked, I think accurately, that these British soldiers, they stood their ground until the bitter end. And part of that was of necessity. Like they did not want to be captured. They understood, thanks to the colonists telling them what was going to happen if they got captured by the Indians. But they nonetheless, they fought in an impossible situation for nearly 4 hours. And even then, the real death knell of that army was the mortal wounding of General Braddock himself. That was kind of from all the accounts, that was the real trigger that led to the army breaking. All right, I think we might have time for one more question, one or two more questions, and.
Well, I was just going to mention this, an excellent book I was given as a gift, and if people here haven't read it.
Did you all hear that?
If you haven't read it, check it out at the library or buy a copy of it, because that is a really good book. And also, that was an excellent film. But it's something the gentleman said back there earlier about it. It was interesting how the French said, okay, east or west of the Ohio, they claimed that the British or the colonists said, okay, east. But what was really pointed in there is what the Indians like, okay, where is our land? Where is our land in this? Because, and that's sort of not exactly what we're talking about here, but the Indians it was their land from the start, and for 400 years they were just kicked out the whole way to the west coast and annihilated, basically. So, that sort of gets lost in this whole thing. Right. And the whole way from Braddock's defeat to St. Clair's defeat to Custer's last stand, and it's just... it was very interesting to say, okay, the Indians thought, like, where do we fit into this equation? Right? And
the interesting thing is, on that point is, the Indians have been going through this cycle of wars also for hundreds. I mean, that map that showed all the tribes, to me, noticeably didn't show the Susquehanna, because they didn't exist anymore. Right. The Iroquois Confederation had wiped them out completely, it removed them from the Ohio Valley.
Right. Yeah, so there's a long backstory. And I think that's part of the cultural knowledge that the British might have had if they had really taken time to study the indigenous geopolitics of North America, or at least listen a little bit more closely to some of the British colonists who really knew the lay of that land. I think, for Braddock, one of my interpretations in the book is that I really dismiss the idea that Braddock dismissed the Indians. He came with orders from his king to conduct diplomacy with native peoples and to assure them of the king's friendship, et cetera, et cetera. And Braddock made earnest efforts to negotiate with the natives. The point was, and the reason that he could only attract a total of 8 natives during his expedition was the fact that in 1755, the appeal of the British interest among Native Americans was just absolutely nil. And part of that had to do with those previous wars, the ways that the British colonists had been expanding and dispossessing natives. The point was there really weren't that many natives in 1755 willing to help the British at all, even when a British officer is appealing to them earnestly. But that's again to the point that you need that cultural awareness, situational awareness, so that you know what you're marching into. One more question.
Doesn't that sort of, not a question, but just a real quick, that sort of flips though. So then you get into the next war, and most of the Native Americans are allied with the British. And so then I guess they have determined that, I think we get a better deal from the British than we are from these colonists, because they are really after our land, and we But, you know, so it's just interesting how, just like you said, you know, 12 years later, that dynamic flips too.
Right, and there it's a kind of situational decision that a lot of natives see that there's probably no love lost for the British here. You know, it's now a lesser of two evils type of choice. Yeah, the shifting of sides and alliances, whether it be France allying with the United States in the Revolution, or native peoples that had destroyed a British army at the Monongahela. The same coalition of nations that fell with Braddock 20 years later are in alliance with the British in the Revolutionary War.
But I think that also is recognizing who do the Indians think the British are. So in 1750, the British are the colonists, and there are these redcoats coming over. But by 20 years later, those colonists aren't British anymore. Those are Americans. And that's really the people that we hated to begin with, because they're the one pushing us out of our land. And so we'll take those British from England, because they don't really come over here. But these damn British Americans, they never leave.
Right. And this is where the British Army, basically the British occupation of Canada and the Great Lakes region, as they have stepped into the shoes of the French, they have now taken on a lot of the attributes of the French and become changed themselves. So you're right. The British of 1777, they're not the British of 1755. So for all these reasons, this is why we study history. This is why we read history above fiction, because this stuff actually happened. And lastly, it is all still so rich and relevant for our own times as perspective, as wisdom for ourselves and how we approach the future. So I want to thank you for coming out tonight and for all of your questions and contributions. If you're gluttons for punishment, I am going to be talking here tomorrow morning about my most recent book called The Other Face of Battle, and one which I co-authored with several other military historians. And we are basically considering the role of irregular warfare in American military history through different case studies that we each contributed to. One of them is Monongahela. Another one is the Battle of Manila in 1899. And the third one is the Battle of Makwan in 2010, which was part of an operation in Afghanistan called Dragon Strike. So again, if you have an interest in hearing about those perspectives, please come here tomorrow, I believe at 10 a.m.
That's correct.
That's right. And thank you again for coming out. I'm happy to stand up here and answer any more questions that you wish to ask. Otherwise, you're dismissed.
Thank you, Dr. Preston. I could spend another hour or two here with you, and I'm glad you're coming back tomorrow morning to give us a little different slant on the French and Indian War and how that character of war evolves to present day. So I'm looking forward to that. So why the French and Indian War? Why did we invite Dr. Preston and even talk about this subject? Well, one, this is not my genre. I'm a 30-year military veteran, but French and Indian War was not my genre until recently. And we're right in south central Pennsylvania. We're kind of in the middle of the French and Indian War. Forbes, Braddock, Washington, the American Royal Regiment at here, Carlisle Barracks. This was the most western outpost for the British during the French and Indian War. Cumberland Valley extended almost to Pittsburgh or to Pittsburgh during that time frame. So it was fought in our county where we live today, but it's much smaller. I want to highlight a few things. Tad Miller is here, Phil Cuccia, and Sam Russell as part of this glorious team that coordinated all this. So thank you, gentlemen. And so this is just the beginning. And so I would like to point out, Phil did a walking tour downtown Carlisle, French and Indian War walking tour. I'm not sure that's ever been done before in Carlisle. And we had a great turnout, and I'm fascinated by the facts that I didn't know until recently, that entrenchments were built in the 1755 timeframe by John Stanwix on Bedford Street to protect the encampment of the British regiment. So we have a welcome center and an art exhibit right here on High Street next door to the Historical Society gift store. It's open the same hours. We're going to run this art exhibit and welcome center until 10 November. Please visit it. There's a wonderful 17-foot timeline of American wars and interventions, both home and abroad, beginning in 1607 to bring you to current to the Ukraine crisis. It's immediately followed by history of the French and Indian War, beginning with basically the breaking of the treaty that William Penn signed with the Lenape Indians that were broken by his sons, leading to the French and Indian War. And then there's an argument that the American way of war was established during the French and Indian War along the Great War Path from New York to Canada. That's an author's thesis, and I think Dr. Preston will kind of tug that forward tomorrow and give us an idea of that character of war, counterinsurgency, insurgency, hybrid warfare, and how it still exists today. And remember, in our country, war is a human phenomenon. It's always war amongst the people. And this particular war, French and Indian War, was tough on the colonists through massacres, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's always an impact on indigenous populations. So where have we come in the last 2 weeks in regard to the symposium, and where are we going? So 2 weeks ago we started with the very nature of war, with the play in Iliad at Dickinson College. We're bringing that back, by the way, by popular demand. And why is that significant? It's Homer's classic play, but updated with a contemporary poet by the name of Thomas Weaver. And what that does, it's not about Achilles or Hector or Priam or Helen or Paris. It's about force itself. It's about violence and rage. That's the main character, the protagonist, or the antagonist, depending on your perspective. And then our next session was What is Truth? And Aeschylus, the ancient Greek philosopher, said the first casualty of war is the truth. And so that's what we're attempting to do, not to be judgmental in the next several months of who did what to whom and why it happened and who's to blame, but to bring out, to parse out the truth of what war really is. What is war, what is peace, and what is justice, and what are those interrelationships. But it's about discerning the truth. And then, just this last Monday, General Dubik, who is our chair for the symposium, who wrote a wonderful book, Just War Reconsidered, 37-year veteran of the U.S. Army, paratrooper, ranger, etc. He's got a long career. Interviewed George Washington, and we're going to bring him back as well out of popular demand. And George Washington is played by Daniel Cross. He's a full-time first-person interpreter. I can't say where he's from because I would violate some legal. I'm sorry, say where's he from?
From Mount Vernon.
Close, yes. But Daniel is from Colonial Williamsburg. He's the full-time first-person interpreter down there. I could have sworn to you when he walked in the room one day with General Dubik, George Washington was in the room, the young George Washington. And at the end of the night, there was no doubt in my mind, I could not even call him Daniel Cross. He was George Washington. And so these two sessions are very much related, and that's why the significance of the film. But that was titled Wartime Leadership, and how somebody who was not formally educated, but burned all 10 fingers during the French and Indian War and became Commander-in-Chief during the American Revolution, and one of our founding fathers, obviously. And so where are we going next? So next week is conflict transformation at Dickinson College for one event on Wednesday, and then here again Thursday evening. I believe it's the same time. And that's important to understand. How do we transform conflict from warring parties to nonviolent relationships? We have not been successful at that, especially over the last 20 years. And of course, that's the paradox of wars, and sometimes force has to be used, but what's war's purpose? Again, I subscribe to Aristotle, to achieve a better peace with justice, and we're not achieving that. So that's next week. October, very quickly, is we're going to talk about the consequences of war, post-traumatic stress, moral injury, with more films and first-person discussion. And then in November, we bring in General Dubik back again, Sir General Rupert Smith, who will be paired together to talk about current crisis and future crisis. Sir General Rupert Smith is a retired United Kingdom officer, 36 years, I think, or 38 years of active duty service. He's still employed by the government of the UK as an advisor. He was Deputy SAC Supreme Allied Commander Europe under General Clark during the Kosovo operation. And he is our senior advisor. And General Dubik will talk about war fighting and war waging, why we're not successful. And General Smith will bring in the utility of force, the art of war in the modern world. And those two together, I think, will give us an idea of why we have not been successful over the last 20 years and may not be successful in the current crisis in Ukraine. And then we talk about just war, just peace, and then we end around the 17th of November. We take a break for the Christmas holidays and the winter holidays, and then we restart again in the winter months of 2023, and we'll continue to May. And then by God's good graces, we will continue the symposium. This is a community project. We'd like to be an ongoing discussion with other topics and events. But again, to have everybody have an understanding as American citizens of what is war, what is peace, what is justice, what are those interrelationships, so we could, before we send our young men and women overseas again for a conflict, that we serve them well, we bring them back, we heal them for those that are injured and hurt, and that we're successful. So I thank you everyone for coming. Please share this event and other events, future events with your colleagues, friends, and neighbors. We welcome you back, and again, I would just like to ask everybody for another round of applause for a wonderful presentation. I don't get paid on commission, but there's a wonderful bookstore by the name of Whistle Stop, who absolutely has those books for sale and on his shelves. So please think about that. So thank you, Dr. Preston. We'll see you tomorrow, and hopefully some of you will be able to join us again.
Scott, are you taping this tomorrow?
Yes, we are.
Okay, because there's several of us that have a conflict that we can't make it tomorrow morning.
Okay, it will be taped. Thank you very much. And please, if you'd like to engage Dr. Preston with any questions, please feel free to do so. Thank you.
Very small question.
Hey, Jeff. Sorry,
Two weeks steroid things.
And also it's kind of the north bank, but by that point, so from